Henry Wallace is a name you may or may not be familiar with, but according to John Nichols, his legacy is critical to understanding the trajectory of the Democratic Party. Nichols' new book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, explores the earliest opposition to the fascist threat of wealthy corporatists, still going on today, and their allies in the media, also still going on today, and how the Democratic Party responded. John Nichols is here with us to talk today about his book and also about his recent article. As you know, John writes for about politics for The Nation. He is the national affairs correspondent there. He has also hosts Next Left, The Nation's podcast, featuring interviews with rising progressive politicians who explain how they plan to change our country. So look for that. John, thanks for joining us on the program.
It's an honor to be with you.
Oh, that's nice. I don't hear that, half as much as I would like.
It is. It's genuinely an honor. And there's so much good work you're doing right now. And so it thrills me. I get a chance to do a lot of media around the country. And especially in this moment, I always want to emphasize how important our independent, speak truth to power media is. We need it now more than ever.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I appreciate that. We're definitely cutting what you just said and putting it into our why this is important and you should watch it reel. So why write about the Democratic Party at this point in time? What do you hope the book conveys to its readers?
Why not write about the Democratic Party in this time? I mean, look, the reality is that the idea for the book came about in a very odd way. I started writing a book about the Republican Party.
Uh-huh.
And I was interested in the question of, why the Republican Party of Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower went to hell. How did the wheels come off? And in doing that work, I came to understand that the reality is the Democratic Party gave the Republicans immense space in which to go far to the right. And the Democratic Party did this by compromising again and again and again on progressive principles. So I thought, well, where can we trace that back to? Where do we see the culture of compromise take over the party? And I came to the conclusion that it was in 1944 when the Democratic ticket of Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace was broken up by bankers and segregationists and corporatists and militarists who knew that Roosevelt was ailing and didn't want a genuine progressive to succeed him. And so they connived, maneuvered, and successfully knocked Wallace off the ticket using the 1944 Democratic Convention. And that's really the starting off point for exploring 75 years of the Democratic Party again and again and again, seeking to marginalize progressives and doing so at its own expense, literally undermining itself, but also undermining the politics of the country. Because when the party that should be progressive is not sufficiently progressive, that creates a great space for the right.
Do you think that at the time that Wallace was trying to say that the media is problematic and the rise of fascism is coming, do you think that the American public were open to hearing that like they are now?
Absolutely, they were. In fact, the fascinating thing is that the efforts to marginalize Wallace started in 1943, around the time that he was overseeing a lot of the war effort during World War II. And a lot of bankers and corporate types got very upset because he was saying people who work in these emergency situations in the US and also in countries that supply the US with materials that we needed to fight the war should be paid a fair wage. And whoa, never heard of that before. No. And there was a lot of anger at that, and also a lot of anger at the fact that Wallace started saying, the U.S. shouldn't be on the side of imperialism and colonialism. If we're dealing with countries around the world, we should be encouraging the spread of democracy because that's what the four freedoms are about. That's what U.S. is fighting for in World War II. And then he got in real trouble because he brought the issues home. And he, in 1943, said to a mass rally in Detroit, if you practice racism here at home, you are practicing what he referred to as Americanized fascism.
Mm.
And so he called out imperialism, he called out colonialism, he called out the exploitation of workers, and he called out racism. That was too much for particular forces in the Democratic Party, so they marginalized him. They pushed him aside. But the fascinating thing is, we know exactly how popular what he was saying was, because in the spring of 1943, as the convention came, there were national polls that showed he was by far the overwhelmingly most popular choice to be Franklin Roosevelt's running mate that year. And the irony of it is, if you fast forward to right now, you will see again and again situations like this. And so
Bernie Sanders.
yeah, well, correct. But this is where the most interesting part of writing the book was. So you go back to those early moments and you see that, and really you can identify the culture of compromise, the culture of money, the culture of corporatism, the culture of militarism, really kind of overwhelming the Democratic Party again and again and again. In that early stage, you see obviously complaints about it now, legitimate complaints, I think. And so what I did was trace it through, and you see it so frequently that the Democratic Party compromised in the 1950s on the issue of race, compromised so horrifically that Adam Clayton Powell, the most prominent African-American elected official in the country, endorsed Dwight Eisenhower in 1956, not the Democratic ticket. He split with the Democratic Party to say the Democratic Party was too close to Southern segregationists. In the 1960s, again and again, the Democratic Party, going to where it shouldn't have gone, particularly on the issue of Vietnam, the incredible fights of 1968. And instead of recognizing this, pushing aside Eugene McCarthy, nominating Hubert Humphrey. 1972, George McGovern gets nominated. He wins the nomination with an incredible coalition, multiracial, multi-ethnic, bringing members of the LGBTQ community into politics as part of that coalition. Not as fully as he should have, but certainly opening doors that had not been opened before. And what happened? A huge number of Democrats formed a group called Democrats for Nixon. They actually actively campaigned against their nominee, bought full-page ads in newspapers, put TV ads on to say, don't vote for our guy. And 1988, Jesse Jackson runs the most exciting campaign of the 1980s for the presidency, transformative campaign, new coalitions. Doesn't win the nomination, pushed aside for vice president.
John, do you have any evidence, as we have today, that it's really corporate influence, money going into people's campaigns, et cetera? Is it the same old BS that's been happening, or are these Democrats really like, no, we need to stay racist, or whatever the case may be?
It's an intersection of a lot of things, and I think this is why we go back to Wallace. And Wallace is such an instructive figure. In 1944, he was challenged by the New York Times. The New York Times was furious at Wallace because he was talking about Americanized fascism. He was saying that racism and sexism were expressions of a divisiveness that harmed the war effort. The New York Times came back and said, no, you're harming the war effort by pointing out that there's racism. You're dividing people here. And so Wallace was invited to write an essay for the New York Times about, it became titled The Dangers of American Fascism. And what he wrote.
So the New York Times, let me just get my mind around. The New York Times was saying, we're all joined together because we believe in racism as a group.
I want to defend the New York Times slightly. The New York Times was saying, you shouldn't be calling out the segregationists. You shouldn't be, talking about this so-called Americanized fascism, because that divides us. And the New York Times actually wrote an editorial in which they said, who are these American fascists, right? At a time when there were segregationists, literally preaching racial hatred in America. And
always count on the Times for
instead of the Times actually got a lot better on these issues, but at that point they were wrong. They were just flat out wrong. And but fascinatingly, and to their credit, they gave Wallace a huge space in the New York Times Magazine to write an essay on American fascism. It's a long essay. Wallace took it very seriously. It appeared in the spring of 1944. And if you go back to that, that's where you find the answer to your question. And I do a chapter on it in the book. Because what he said was, that the danger in America would not be a European like fascism. It wouldn't be jackboots and things like that. It would be people in suits and ties waving the flag, preaching from the Bible, perhaps, but saying
that's what we have.
Hard to imagine. But saying that we're going to divide people up. Some people better than others, playing to race hatred, playing to religious hatred. And his point was that corporatists, those who wanted wealth and power, would manipulate the media and would manipulate our politics to divide us so that a mass working class, multiracial, multi-ethnic, respecting women, respecting people of different religions, different ethnicities, if that could be divided up, the corporatists would have their power. That was his simple message. It was said in 1944. I think what's remarkable—
the corporatists were like, great idea, let's get on it.
Let's divide people. And you know what? It has worked. Divisiveness in our politics has worked over the last 75 years to separate people who should be together in mass coalitions. And I would argue that if you read Henry Wallace's essay from 1944 and just put it right up against the reality of Donald Trump, you see so many connections. But if you just stop there, right, and say, oh yeah, well, Wallace was warning about Trump. No, Wallace was warning about a circumstance where a Trump might rise. And that's where my concerns, my objections to how the Democratic Party has handled itself over the years come in. This is not a condemnation of the Democratic Party. This is an examination of why the Democratic Party keeps falling into traps that undermine it politically and that undermine the sort of politics that we should have in America, that really, again, create a space for the right.
So 1944 was how many years ago? 60-ish?
76, my friend.
76, thank you, the fast math. If I read your book about how nothing has changed over 76 years in the Democratic Party, am I going to be more depressed than I already am? Or what's my I'm sure you've come up with some, some through lines of success and how—
you know me, right? I'm looking for the good.
Absolutely.
And no, this book is really an examination of the error. I'm certainly not a physician, and shout outs today to nurses and physicians who are actually doing the important work. But it is a diagnosis. It's an effort to say that the Democratic Party is by and large better than the Republican Party today on a host of issues. I don't think that's debatable. I know some people may object to that, but I don't.
Not anyone in this audience.
No, I'd say the Democratic Party is a better party. And that it has evolved on a host of issues in very, very good ways. It is today the party that's more likely to call out racism, the party that's more likely to call out gender bias, the party that is more likely to call out bias against LGBTQ community, the party that is at least marginally more in favor of economic and social and racial justice for saving the planet. And I'm not going to give it the best marks on peace, but it's got a record that's credible. But the problem is that when the Democratic Party comes to power, instead of coming to power as a fighting force that is ready to seize all the levers of government and to turn them toward that struggle for economic and social and racial justice, for saving the planet, for peace, too frequently in power, the Democratic Party compromises. It narrows its vision. Instead of taking from FDR and Henry Wallace the best of what that time was about, which was constant innovation, a passion for trying to solve problems, not always solving them, and making huge mistakes. This is not some sort of, Roosevelt was the perfect figure. In fact, there's quite a substantial section of the book on Japanese internment and things like that. But it does say that at that time, there was at least an effort to try to go big when you had power. My argument is that when the Democratic Party doesn't go big when it has power, you end up with situations like Bill Clinton getting elected in 1992, losing as a majority in 1994. Barack Obama elected in 2008 with a very strong majority, losing a lot of his ability to govern in 2010 in that Republican wave. And so I argue that by adopting a much more progressive vision and building out a movement politics, it is much more possible to get power, hold it, and do great things.
Can you talk a little bit before we switch on to, I don't want to keep you here all day, but switch onto your article. Can you talk about why the Democratic Party continues to temper voices like Wallace's? We're seeing this today with AOC, with their, coalescing around Biden to stave off the Sanders rise. I believe people in our audience often talk about how we need to just throw off the Democratic Party because for all of these years they have not served the voices of the working class. They have not served the voices of the people, and they are tired of this, and they don't want to work within the party. And yet there's all this fear that, if we don't support the party, we'll have a Trump, which is kind of what happened because people bring themselves to vote for Hillary, and then now we have Trump. That's part of why we have Trump, right? So what's the forward game to get the should we try to continue to push the Democratic Party in a more progressive direction, or should people who really feel like their needs are not being heard by the Democratic Party take a more radical approach?
So you just put everything on the table.
Yes. And take what you like, leave the rest.
Yeah, but it's all there, right? And so that core, the first thing you were asking about, why does the Democratic Party compromise again and again and again? It's because they didn't listen to Franklin Roosevelt when he said we have nothing to fear but fear itself. The Democratic Party is a party that operates again and again from fear rather than confidence. It was fear rather than confidence that knocked Wallace off the ticket in 1944. It was fear rather than confidence that led Democrats for Nixon to form because they didn't like George McGovern. It was fear rather than confidence that led them to not put Jesse Jackson on the ticket in 1988.
So you really think it's fear? It's not things like racism and like saddling up to corporate power. That, saddling up to corporate power seems less like fear and more like, oh, I want to get my good too. Using power for evil instead of for the people. You think it's
more? So, but let's close the circle, okay? Fear rather than confidence that prevented them from putting Jesse Jackson on in 1988. Instead, went with the exciting Lloyd Benson.
I don't even remember that name. Yeah,
he's an incredibly boring man. And a fear rather than confidence that again and again, not in every instance. There are times that the party has broken forward and done and I think nominating Obama in 2008 is an example of that. But remember, there's a lot of resistance to that. And so this fear rather than confidence thing, what's the root of that? It is a sense on the part of a lot of Democratic leaders that they can't win without money. They can't win without being friendly toward multinational corporations, without doing trade deals like NAFTA and China free trade and things like that. Now, where is what's the root of that? They want power. They want office. They want positions. But instead of putting their confidence in the great mass of people, they put their confidence in a system that is slathered in money, right? And so they compromise with it. Now, you can say that they do it because they're bad players. You can say they do it just because they're, they don't know what else to do. Whatever the reason, you don't have to diagnose the reason. You just have to diagnose the reality that it happens again and again.
Well, what about now that Bernie Sanders has proven that you can run a successful campaign off of $27 contributions and not having to take billionaire money?
You think Joe Biden's learned that lesson?
No, I haven't. This is why.
Yeah, there you go.
Not necessarily the party. I don't think Joe Biden could be supported by $27 donations because he doesn't excite the people that he's going to, actually support what they want, be a working class hero.
You get to the heart of the matter there. You get to the heart of the matter there. Again and again, the Democratic Party has had options to go with mass movement campaigns.
And they blow it.
Nominating McCarthy in 68 would have been a better move than nominating Humphrey. Backing McGovern would have been a better move than abandoning him. Putting Jesse Jackson on the ticket in 88 would have been a better move than putting a boring Texan on the ticket. Again and again, they abandon the route that would be a mass movement politics and go for the route that says, oh, we'll raise a lot of money from some people at a cocktail party in LA. And so that leads to the second part of your very good question, which is, you know, why not just abandon these guys? Why not just say they always put these barriers in the way, and let's just go for an alternative? I favor multi-party politics. I think it's healthy. I think it gets us away from personalities and toward ideas and values and issues. I've covered elections in 25 countries around the world. I think multi-party politics is an appealing concept. Unfortunately, in the United States, almost everything in our political structures are weighted against that. It's hard to get on the ballot. Our media doesn't cover third party and alternative runs.
People would have to actually think about the nuances of policy if people weren't diametrically opposed to each other.
That's right. And if it wasn't trying to be these weird, sort of overwhelmingly broad coalitions that you can't offend somebody who you should offend. And so you end up in this situation where the infrastructure of American politics is designed to undermine those who seek to create an alternative avenue. And I read about that a lot in the book because Henry Wallace did try it in 1948 after he was pushed out of the Democratic Party. He tried to form a broad left coalition that went, all the way across the left spectrum, included, socialists, communists, reformers, peace activists, civil rights activists, militant trade unionists. He really tried to put it together. And at early stages, he was polling very well. He was drawing mass crowds to rallies. And then an interesting thing happened as you got toward the election. I write about this. The entire media is like, you don't have to throw eggs at Wallace. Just don't vote for him. They literally were literally editorials that said, hey, back off on getting violent with him.
We know we made you hate him. But...
Yeah. And so the end result is that keeps happening. And so that is another reality. And it's one that we have to wrestle with. It doesn't argue against alternative routes. It doesn't argue against an independent or third-party politics. But it does argue that if you're going to do that, you must recognize the incredible barriers that are in front of you. And you must also recognize to my mind, the incredible possibility that working within the Democratic Party over time might crack it open. And boy, there are so many arguments against this. I respect people who, say, no, I'm just not I don't buy it anymore. I'm not going to accept it. And not only do I accept that, I'll write about those people and hear what they say. But I look at someone, the book closes, the final chapter of the book is I went to Wallace's farm where he was born with Bernie Sanders. I traveled in other parts of the Midwest with Ro Khanna. I went to Detroit where Wallace gave his great speech on race with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And all these people are woven through the close of the book toward an argument that they, at this point at least, are fighting within the Democratic Party for reasons that AOC has suggested, that in another system she would not be in the same party as Biden. In this system, they're jammed together. And so I guess my core argument would be that people should go where their heart takes them and where their head takes them. They should do the politics that makes sense to them, because politics is at its best when it is a combination of heart and head. There will be folks who do third-party activism. There will also be folks who fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. And when they do so, my only argument is they should do so with an understanding that they are in a fight, that this isn't just a family squabble, right? That corporate power will always fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. If you're going to take that power on, you'd better recognize you're in a fight, and you better recognize that what it is about is seizing this party for a progressive vision of racial and economic and social justice, saving the planet and peace. And if you're not incredibly stalwart on that, if you're not incredibly clear in what you're fighting about, you're going to end up in the situation that Wallace ended up in, that McCarthy, McGovern, Jackson, and so many others over the years.
The book is called The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. We're speaking with John Nichols of The Nation. You can follow him on Twitter at Nichols Uprising. Next bike in our Twitter feed says the Supreme Court is not going to wait for a more progressive Democratic Party. The only way to hold their feet to the fire is to jump into the fire with them. An argument for being active within the party, even if you're going to be active outside of the party. Let me check, John, before you go to see if our next guest is on with us. If she is, I have to let you go. If not, I'm going to pepper you with questions about your recent article. Oh, good. She's not here. I mean, I don't.
No. We want her to be here soon.
We want her to be here, and you can still go even if she's not here. But hopefully, everything is.
Go ahead.
I'm sure she'll be here soon. We, Professor Julianna Malveaux is coming on with us.
Oh, she's brilliant. Yeah,
I know, she's amazing. She used to be on with us every. It's a great show. You, her, it made my Tuesday. I'm thrilled. Okay, so your latest piece in The Nation is called Mass Unemployment is a Policy Choice. Pramila Jayapal has a plan that responds with a New Deal level of urgency. I read your article. Let's discuss, because I have some questions. Can you talk about what Jayapal's plan is and why you think it's a good idea, which is what I gleaned from your article?
Oh, I think it's a good idea. Maybe not the only idea, but it's one. And remember, if we go back to the New Deal, right? Again, dealing with mass unemployment, they tried 10 ideas a week. But they wanted to go big. These were ideas that actually tried to solve things. So
the title of your piece, which was so great, is that, again, mass employment is a policy.
Mass unemployment.
Mass unemployment. Yes.
Yeah, and it really is. I mean, you can address it because we know around the world they do. In Germany, in the last Great Recession, they had a program where the government comes in and provides some resources to help keep people on their jobs. And so instead of sending people into the unemployment system, you provide subsidies and support to keep people working. The United Kingdom just did that. Denmark has done it. And there is a proposal by Pramila Jayapal to do it here. It's supported by Robert Reich, by Joseph Stiglitz, by most of the major trade unions in the United States. And it is an idea that's really big. It proposes spending a lot of money to keep people on their jobs, even if they're not working full time.
And paying them, even if they're not paying them their salaries.
Yes. And looking for vehicles by which they could keep their benefits, because we don't have a national healthcare system, which we should. And for ways, if you're going to quote unquote reopen the economy, that instead of having sent people through this terrible maze of struggle to get unemployment insurance and things like that, that they will have remained kind of in place, ready to start up. And the incredible thing about Jayapal's plan is that it adjusts. If the economy goes up, the government pays out less to make this work. If the economy falls back down, if there's a double dip on coronavirus, then the government moves more resources in. The bottom line being is that with planning, we could actually have a small measure of economic stability here that we don't have right now.
People are going to be pissed off if, say, for example, someone I know, a friend, let's say, has to work from home 8 hours a day while watching a kid and having there be no childcare, and then someone else gets $100,000 for not having to work. How are you going to? That plan is just not going to fly in America.
Maybe not, but it's worked in Britain under a conservative government. It's worked in Germany under a government.
I'm going to get a card to live over there.
Well, it's worked in Germany under center-right governments. Look.
Well, wouldn't it be a better way to ensure kind of equal spread of justice for all, just to have a Medicare for all system?
Absolutely, I'm all for it. Let's go.
I don't want people to not have anything to eat. I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate.
No, you're not playing devil's advocate at all. Your argument is a very good one, but in this case, it's an interesting thing. The sponsor of this bill, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal,
yes,
is also the sponsor of Medicare for All.
Right.
So there you go.
It's not like is this like, if that doesn't work, I'll just do this? I mean,
no, she's not working against herself. This is an emergency measure. This is a measure for right now. Like, if this was enacted today, with the support of Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. Uh, but if it was enacted today, which is a hard fight, but a fight worthy of making, we could slow the growth of mass unemployment. And if you read economic history and social history, what you're going to recognize, and I know you know this, and I think probably overwhelming majority of your audience does, that mass unemployment is an incredibly destructive reality. If it leads to mass movements and demands for, social and economic and racial justice, great. But unfortunately, in times of mass unemployment, you often see a real desperation come in politically and socially. It's just harmful to people.
Yeah. I don't want people to be starving and desperate.
Yeah.
But also, it seems like a move like that would undermine some of the other things that might be great. Some of the more what they call radical measures, like universal basic income for all people. Like, how about the strike? The reason people need money is they need to eat and they need to pay their rent. So if you're paying your rent, this is basically just another handout to the bank. So how about can we get a little more radical on this? Can we say, hey, banks, why don't you shut the doors for 3 months and just let everybody chill, and then we'll start paying once this thing opens up again?
Well, here's the interesting thing. Our federal government already bailed out the banks.
I know, and this seems like they're doing it again.
And it already bailed out Wall Street. It already bailed out the big corporations. It's possible at a time when we've got 15% unemployment, higher unemployment among African Americans and Latinos, and the possibility that we could go to 20, even 25% unemployment. It's possible that we might want to take a few steps to protect the rest of us.
Right.
And again, it's interesting that we always have these struggles. In the 1930s, when Social Security,
exactly. Sorry, John. It's right exactly what you were talking about in your book. Can we go big? If we can't go big with our asks in the middle of a pandemic when people are starving, when are we going to go big? I mean, as a Democratic Party. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I couldn't agree with you more.
Not that I'm saying. I mean, I'm glad that Jayapal is doing this. I just wanted to have this kind of.
And you see, I think that the important thing to recognize here is exactly the way that you're putting it. Is exactly the way it should be put, right?
Why I make the big act.tv dollars.
Act.tv dollars, yeah, which are going to go up when you start selling those shower curtains. But this is exactly the way it should be. We should do immediate triage to help those who are suffering now, and there are a host of steps that can be taken. Ro Khanna and Tim Ryan have proposed $2,000 monthly check to everybody who qualifies. I think it's an overwhelming number of Americans. A really good idea. Jayapal is proposing a initiative to keep people on their jobs rather than to push them out into a quote unquote work world where there's very little work, if any, right? And that's actually very structurally sound for reopening the economy. It's also bringing something that we don't have in America to America, which is planning. I.e., I know, but that's what other countries do. And it's really valuable. And so these steps, right? Putting off the rent, keeping people whole in their jobs. Yep, that's a president calling in to say he's on board now.
It's Malvo. She's calling you instead of me.
No, she's not, and I'm afraid.
I too.
It's just insane here, and I apologize.
It's absolutely fine. We totally get it. I mean,
I'm not a fan, but it will be done momentarily. Yeah. And so here's the bottom line, the really important bottom line. Abating rent. Keeping people whole in their work, providing structural supports for all sorts of initiatives. These are immediate responses to the challenge that we're in. They're all good, right? Lowering the Medicaid and Medicare ages and accessibility right now to say that if you don't have health care, you can just go right into this program. These are things that have been proposed. Bernie Sanders talked about that, and Congresswoman Jayapal's talked about that. So we put all those forward. And those are immediate, huge responses. Save the Postal Service, do a bunch of other things. At the same time, you don't abandon big thinking. And that actually goes back. I mean, I don't want to circle back to Wallace always.
Please do.
But in the midst of World War II, when he was an incredible advocate for the fight against fascism overseas, he was writing books saying, when we get done with World War II, we've got to switch our policy so we don't back colonialism anymore. Now, that made Winston Churchill very unhappy. He was writing books that says, coming out of World War II, if we're going to have a stable economy, we have to create 60 million jobs. I want to emphasize that. 60 million jobs. Now, he didn't propose that after World War II. He proposed it during World War II. So you see the dynamic here. Initiatives to immediately address the crisis of the moment with big thinking parallel to it. And you fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, or more broadly, our politics, so that it is a politics of big ideas and big responses. And also, when you get power, of big action, government actually doing something rather than, kind of, like figuring out, oh, are our deficits too high, right? And so, I mean, this is, we have to get to a kind of all in sort of concept of this, that we can meet the challenge of the moment and we can meet the challenge of the future. The only barrier to that is if we defer to corporate power and to its media apologists, right? Mm-hmm. They're the ones who will tell us we can't do it. The fact of the matter is we can. And, in writing the book, one of the things I was powerfully struck by is that so many of the things that were proposed by progressives in the 1940s are now things you couldn't possibly oppose, right? Treating women fairly, equally.
Forget it.
Ending racism, right? I mean, these are things you couldn't possibly oppose. And if you're in your right mind.
But anyway.
Yeah. And again, in the 1960s, you saw, civil rights campaigners and economic justice campaigners in that period proposing things that you couldn't today possibly oppose. And, even into the 1980s, when, there were points in the Democratic Party, there was a huge battle over, how big to go on gay rights. Today, the party recognizes, well, that'd be absurd to oppose it. And so my only argument is, let's just speed it up. Let's just say, if you got a great idea, let's go for it now.
Absolutely.
And let's go big.
Well said. You always are the person we come to for the go big or go home ideas. We're speaking with John Nichols of The Nation, the new book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, out now. Is that correct?
It is just out this week.
Oh, how exciting. I feel very happy to be one of the first to interview you about it now that it is available on, I guess, e-shelves. Question, we have a comment coming from the stream chat that an audio book would be wonderful because you are very interesting to listen to. Are you going to be reading this thing for Audible?
Audible, I've worked with them a little bit in the past. We'll see if it works out. I have to say, in addition to making a fine holiday gift,
or whatever holiday may be coming up.
Whatever holiday is coming. I just missed Mother's Day. Yeah. And the book is dedicated to my mother, the most radical person I know, but by far. There are so many great stories, and I feel incredibly privileged to tell these stories. And one of the things, in the book, going across these 75 years, you get to sample out the people who really did amazing things. And I just cannot begin to emphasize how remarkable it was in the early 1970s, a time 50 years ago, almost lost to history, when Democratic incumbents were challenged by people who identified as radicals, and the radicals won. And so Bella Abzug went to the U.S. Congress. Shirley Chisholm went to the U.S. Congress, first African.
Brooklyn, yeah.
Brooklyn represents. And out in California, Ron Dellums was elected to Congress as a radical candidate, proudly radical. And, Ron Dellums, elected in 1970, in interviews said, yeah, I think democratic socialism is the way to go. And it's a real answer to our problems. He advocated for, radical reappropriation of money from the Pentagon over to human needs. This isn't Bernie Sanders in 2020. This is 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I want to do, or that I did the book, and I want to keep doing, is to emphasize that there's very little that's new now. But if we understand the history and we understand the remarkable people along the way, Shirley Chisholm, Belle Abzug, Ron Dellums, George McGovern, Jesse Jackson, and Henry Wallace, and others, if we recognize that they've been there all along and that in the past they've been undermined, then let us ask ourselves this. In a moment of global pandemic, in a moment where our economy has melted down, maybe, wouldn't it be a good idea for those who are in our politics to recognize that radical ideas have often been right, have often won, and if we get out of the way and put them forward, coherently, strongly, passionately, that they are the answers to this moment. Just as in the 1930s and early 1940s, Roosevelt and Wallace did things that were condemned as incomprehensibly radical, right? They wired America. They got everybody connected up through rural electrification. They said, if you're unemployed, we're going to find you a job. They ultimately, and under pressure from A. Philip Randolph and the civil rights movement of that era, integrated the military industries, literally opening factories up. Now, again, they made mistakes along the way, bad mistakes, but they went big and they tried. And those radical solutions are today understood as so valuable that when we talk about a Green New Deal today, we borrow the term New Deal. And so why not do the Green New Deal? Why not do radical interventions and recognize that that's so much more appealing, that's so much more possible than we've been told.
I always tried to remind people that even if the top of the ticket doesn't represent the radical view, it's, radical things and progressive things have been happening all along. And so not to get disheartened if we don't catch the big fish, but to keep the pushing from the bottom.
I think you're so right. And remember, this is one of the things I write about a lot in the book. I always keep kind of bringing the social history and the movement history in. And I think that's really important because Wallace was strong as vice president and had support because of the movements that he embraced. He embraced movements against racism. He embraced movements against anti-Semitism. He embraced movements for economic justice, the unions especially. Similarly, throughout history, you look at, why did the Rainbow Coalition do as well as it did in the 1980s? It was because Jesse Jackson embraced movements. I would argue, why did Bernie Sanders do as well in 2016 and mount the second most successful campaign of 2020? Because he embraced movements. He was informed by movements. He was made better by movements. And why do we get excited about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and other rising figures in our politics? I think it's because they embrace movements and they amplify the voices of those movements. And so if we understand it in that way, we start to look at politics very differently. Instead of looking at politics where some great man comes along and leads us out of the wilderness, politics becomes a place where the great men and women are folks who listen to movements and bring their genius in, realize that you can build that out, and realize, frankly, the wisdom of Eugene Victor Debs, the great socialist of the early part of the 20th century, who said, and I paraphrase, if I could lead you into paradise, I wouldn't do it, because if I could lead you in, someone else could lead you out. I want you to build your own way into paradise, and I want to go with you.
Wow, that's well said, and an excellent place to leave this. It's been a really great interview, and I hate that I've missed out on Julianne Malveaux, but I'm kind of glad she didn't come because it gave us an extra 20 minutes. I'm not sure what happened. I'm sure we'll check in with her and hopefully all is well. We're speaking with John Nichols from The Nation. His new book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, out now. We're waiting for it. We're waiting also for it to come out on Audible, but you could just listen to this interview in the meantime before you get the book. Thanks, John, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Again, I'm honored to be with you, and I'll be tuning in to see Julianne Malveaux when she's on.
I know that it's going to be great. You're watching Act TV. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. We bring you the voices of the progressive fight, progressive thinkers, progressive fighters, activists, interesting people about 8 to 10 times a week here on this YouTube channel. So please subscribe and tell your friends. If you're watching on Facebook, that is it for our show today. We will be back tomorrow. Again, share this stream with your friends. And thanks again for watching. And if you're watching on Twitch, stick with us. I'll be back in a quick second. Thanks again, John.
Thank you.